we're a part of this. So I am Terry Cullen. I'm a physician. I actually lead a local public health department now for the last year, so I've been a little distracted with COVID. But our group has really been working on adoption. And I'll let Jane introduce herself, and then we have a quick series of slides to just give you an overview of the work we've been doing, and then we will go from there and we can delve into any detail you want us to delve into. So Jane, do you want to talk about who you are?
Sure. So I'm Jane Shellum, and I apologize I didn't get my last name in the webinar here, but I am the administrator for the Knowledge Management and Delivery Program at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And I also am a clinical knowledge engineer, so I also do some hands-on work with the BPM Plus standards in modeling clinical pathways at Mayo Clinic to support our practice. I've been with the BPM Plus community, I think, since its inception. The first meeting several years ago, as Ken mentioned, and really enjoy working with Dr. Cullen and this group and the entire community.
Yeah, so I am now going to try to do the WebEx share, and hopefully you're seeing my screen. Do you got it?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Oh, not yet.
Well, that's coming up. Just so everyone knows, we are recording the session, so it's available on demand later. So just a heads up.
Now you got it, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'm going to leave it in this view just to make sure I don't screw it up as I go along. The other day I was on something and I was on Zoom and I hadn't been on Zoom in a while. I'm like, oh, there's too many changes. Okay, so we're going to talk about the readiness assessment and maturity model work that we have been doing. The next slide is really something very similar to what Ken talked about, which is what BPM is. And so I'm not going to spend any time on that because we really want to talk about the adoption readiness assessment and maturity model and where we've gotten. So this is a slide that we have stolen from BPM Plus overall, but you can see these are the things that we're really interested in making sure we do. And then let me go to the health work groups, because this is where we start getting into the meat of what we're doing. So we are one of 5 health work groups. We are the Organizational Adoption and Change Management. Our name has been modified over the past year to reflect what we are focused primarily on. But the point of this session is to walk you through what we are doing for adoption readiness and what tools we have developed that we hope will be helpful for any organization that is in the practice and wants to make a commitment to move ahead with BPM Plus. These are the artifacts we have developed. The first one you are aware of, I am sure if you're aware of BPM Plus, the shareable clinical pathways that has been out for a while. What we have done is really focused on a readiness assessment and maturity model called the RAMM for short. And hopefully you have seen that up till now, but you may not have, and we can spend a little time on that if need be. But the primary focus today is really on the Health Adoption Guide Playbook. I'm sure you're all familiar with playbooks. In the COVID world, playbooks are our mantra these days. They're so critical for us to accelerate change and accelerate adoption of anything we're doing. So what we have spent the last year doing is working collectively, and that collectively is really important because what you're going to hear about today is really a compilation and a culmination of many people's different experiences, interpretations, guidance, knowledge, as well as how do we lead organizations that are interested in BPM Plus into the future, meaning how do we help guide them in their adoption. And so we now have a 26-page playbook that really, to tell you the truth, is still a draft. It's in pretty good shape, but I would argue it's still a draft that we really have just finished up in the last 2 days to be able to present to you effectively. So we're going to talk to you about what is in this playbook, and you can see what we have focused on and discussed as we move forward with all of this. We first off believed that we really needed to have a value proposition that was reflective of what organizations would look at as they went through, and we can go through the details on this once we give you the overview. Next, there's the maturity model. That's the RAMM that I talked about. And I don't know how many of you have had an opportunity to look at the maturity model. It's a fairly typical maturity model in that it specifically looks at 5 levels, level 1 through level 5, and then looks at multiple different components of maturity, including things like institutional standards, stakeholder management, adoption processes, privacy, security, confidentiality, skills and expertise, knowledge, assets, tools, and automation, and goals and measurement. And I have to say, as I start talking about this, it makes me realize we've done a lot of work, and hopefully it will be of value to all of you. So each of those different buckets would then have, as a typical maturity model would have, a level of what it meant to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We believed that this is critical for a health adoption playbook because the recommendation within the playbook is that sites and organizations and individual groups that want to adopt and move forward with BPM Plus would spend some time reflecting on their own personal maturity. As a good maturity model, which we hope this is, it should help guide an organization of how to go from level 1 to level 2. And obviously, as you know, in maturity models, you don't have to be at the same level throughout all the different composition. You can go up and down in certain ones depending upon what your organization has committed to. Next, we talk in the health adoption playbook specifically about stakeholders. As you can imagine, there are multiple stakeholders that need to be engaged in any kind of health adoption as we move forward. There are the executives and the managers, technologists, modelers, developers, implementers. We have this huge list, and there's more, etc. And all those people are important members of engaging into the commitment to moving ahead with health adoption. And at the end of this, I'm actually going to let Jane talk before we go into any more specific details at the end of the slides, because she has a ton of experience and just recently did a major BPM Plus adoption at Mayo. And after that, then we go into the adopting clinical practice guidelines. You know, that's kind of the meat of what we're doing, right? So value, maturity, stakeholders, pretty typical for most organizations as they do any kind of change management. So there's nothing unique there. The maturity model is unique for BPM Plus, but the rest of it should be really familiar to anyone that's ever adopted and or engaged in change management. The adopting the clinical practice guidelines, which is the BPM Plus health adoption, is really the critical part of this. And what you'll see in what we do there is we go specifically into identification of use cases, identification of engagement for success, readiness, making sure that you've addressed all the specific details that are required to help improve your chances of success of adopting clinical practice guidelines. Now, I would argue in this part of the playbook, when you look at it, there is definitely a need for additional fleshing out of some of these specifics. Our goal, as with any playbook, is that this is an iterative engagement. Our hope is that we are engaging with you and others that may be interested in this, that it is, like I stated, a work in progress, and that we will continue to upgrade it and modify it based on information we learned from you. Finally, the next is evaluation and metrics. So in evaluation and metrics, we have given in the workbook some proposed metrics. They obviously would need to be modified to be reflective for the organization that is engaged in that. There's measuring new pathway processes, measuring impact and outcome. I'm a clinician, so there obviously is this need to ensure that what we're doing really does have a positive impact. Measuring adoption itself. With the belief that there are ways to accelerate all of those. And once again, there are ways that we can learn from you based on your experience and your sharing today initially, and then as we go forward. And finally, there's this concept of lessons learned. And for those of you, once again, familiar with playbooks, the lessons learned are critical. We have some lessons learned in here, but the hope is that this playbook will be used by you and your organization. And those lessons learned will be actually filled in by you. So we have some that we know have worked historically when we look at BPM Plus and adopting clinical practice guidelines, but it's really designed for you to help give us more information. So I'm now going to go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, Terry, before you go on, we had a question just to elaborate a little bit on the evaluation and metrics section, and really to distinguish between the different kinds of metrics. So there are the metrics about the pathway itself. Does it get us to the patient care goals we were looking for? Does it reduce complications? Does it improve outcomes? Does it improve clinical behavioral processes? Are people prescribing the right things, et cetera? So that has to do with the measurement of the pathway itself, but we also want to measure the effectiveness of the adoption process. So what is the uptake of the new process? What is the time to implementation? What is the cost of implementation? So we're really measuring a couple of different things. We're measuring the adoption process and how well we did as an organization to get the new process in place. And then does the new process give us the outcomes? Does it solve the business problem that we intended it to solve? And we kind of want to cover the waterfront on those things. They're kind of different ideas and you need to do both. And Ken, do you have any other thoughts on that one?
No, I thought you described that beautifully.
And I would say when you get the opportunity to give us your feedback on the playbook itself, what you'll see is that we've started, we filled in some charts for all of these with some proposed metrics. But for those of you who have been in the metrics world, you know the specific definition of the numerator and the denominator is what is the gotcha with all metrics. We haven't gone that far with this. So we would hope that you could give us some information and feedback on that. And the other thing is the metrics, when we approach this, remember the huge list of stakeholders with the recognition that the metrics may be specific, for instance, to an organizational stakeholder versus a clinical stakeholder. So for me, at least coming from a lot of work in the metrics background over the past few decades, I think that these are really critical, but they will need to be specific for your organization as you roll it out. I think Jane and I would both agree that paying, even though that's one of the last sections in the playbook, you don't want to work through the entire playbook and then at the end go, oh, now I need some metrics. As you're going through, you'll try to design your metrics to reflect what you're seeing. Jane, anything else about that one?
No, I'm just smiling because I am guilty often of waiting till that last chapter and saying, oh, yeah, we should measure something. Don't do that.
Yeah. Well, and I have to say, as we wrote the playbook, we were all guilty of that. We were like, oh, metrics, they'll be easy at the end. And
Yeah.
as you know, they're never that as easy as you think. So
They are not.
So let me go basically then a little back to what we, the RAMM, to spend a little time now. I rattled off these really quickly for you earlier when I talked about what was involved in the RAMM itself and the different capabilities that we were considered. I think Jane would agree with me. We probably spent 5 months working on the RAMM. Maybe it was a little more, a little less. It was
a little more. I know we started pre-COVID.
Yeah,
we started it face-to-face. So, yep.
So the RAMM took us a while, and I am gonna see if this will work. Can you guys now see?
Yeah.
A PowerPoint. Okay, I'm trying to make this. So this probably needs to be increased in size, but I probably can't figure out how to do that rapidly. So this is just an example of the RAMM and the different levels. And well, this is now embedded in the playbook itself. It's a separate document, but also embedded in the playbook. So it gives you some sense of that. Let me get that out of there. So I think what's important about the RAMM is that this was really based on best practices. Looking at multiple maturity models Ken led us, as well as other people that were involved in the group. It's probably, the hope is that you would be able to identify your own institution by working through this. We have done some internal, members of the group itself have looked at this and used it themselves on their own organizations. I'm a pretty firm believer in maturity models and the impact of them. So I don't know if anybody wants to say anything about that, or I'm sure you're going to want to look at the specifics of what we've done as we go forward. But you can see these capabilities that were considered. These were modified over the course of what we were doing. So. Okay, so I'm going to now go forward and talk a little bit about what we want to do with you and our next steps. So the BPM Plus Health Adoption Guide Playbook, Ken, my understanding is it's published somewhere. I looked on the collaboration site and didn't see the latest model.
Give me 1 second. And yeah, so here's where we are with that. I'm dropping it on the collaboration site as we speak. But we posted a PDF of the document on the BPM website under resources. So give me 1 second and I will drop a link in the chat. This was a just-in-time release.
Yeah, just in time. No, it was yesterday. It's because I thought the meeting was yesterday. So that's why I got it on Monday.
Oh, okay. Oh, so we had lots of time.
Yeah, really, I had 36 hours.
Yeah, I'm just gonna drop the resources stuff so people also have access to that. So in the chat, if you click that link, and Terry, you can do this just to show people.
Yeah, this one, right?
I'm seeing a PowerPoint, not a browser.
Yeah, that's because I haven't clicked it yet. Let's see. External.
And these are all the.
Is that right? Am I going to the right place? Yeah.
Yep, that's right. And if you look under publications,
Hey.
it's the second one. Voila.
Okay.
This is the PDF version, Terry.
Okay. Yeah. So here you guys go. So you'll be able to check that out if you want. I'm going to go back to the slides just to finish that, and then we can come back here if we need to. Our goal with this engagement this morning was really to just show you where we are. Obviously, we haven't gone into the whole detail. That's 26 pages, but we can go back to whatever part of it you want. Let you be aware of the RAMM, and the RAMM is embedded now in the playbook, but it's also a separate document. Is it? I don't know. It's a separate document on the collaboration site. It may not be here.
We need to post that on the website as a separate downloadable as well. We'll do that.
Okay. Okay. And so we wanted to talk with you this morning about ways that this might be helpful for you, whether you have had any experience with maturity models yourself, your input into what we've done so far, ways you can use the playbook through a pilot, and that's where I'm going to let Jane talk a little bit about, and then how we can engage with people to get feedback to the organization and BPM Plus. We do have another slide, but Jane, do you want to talk a little bit about, before we go on, about your personal experience and what you've been doing with BPM Plus and clinical guidelines?
Sure. So I'm actually kind of coming at it from two directions. One is the creation of clinical pathways or translation of clinical pathways into the BPM Plus standards, and then implementing those into the clinical practice, which is really our focus here today. But just briefly, the business motivation for what we're trying to do is is trying to bring our clinical pathways into the workflow. So I'm sure that people can relate to the challenge that we have, that there are great resources out there, clinical guidelines, pathways that are published, but they are in a text format or a semi-structured format that make them very difficult to apply in the context of a clinical encounter. And so our organization, in an effort to better embed these clinical pathways into the workflow, has engaged in trying to make them more computable, and to model them using the BPM Plus standard. And we are developing an application that works in conjunction with our medical record, that provides the guidance of pathways, bringing together patient data and clinical knowledge using the BPM Plus standard as interpreted by our application. So basically, it's a cognitive support application that complements the medical record, and it is fully powered by BPM Plus models. And I work with a colleague that some of you have met, Davide Satara, who is an absolute stickler for standards. And every time I think of a workaround, he will lecture me on whether or not it's a part of the standard. So it's been a really, that side of it has been a really great journey. And now we are poised on the adoption side of it. So we're bringing these into the practice. And so what that means is, we are considering, as Terry mentioned, all of the different stakeholders, from organizational management to the caregivers to our quality folks who gather metrics, all of the different stakeholders that are involved. We're thinking about training and communication. Do we have the right skills in place to implement these pathways? We are very fortunate in that we have a culture already of consensus-driven, standardized best practices. And so we're blessed in our organization in that it's not such a heavy lift to convince anybody of the value. So when we talk about the value proposition, that is really the first case, or the first step is, how do you communicate the value of implementing these BPM Plus pathways into your organization? What is the value to the organization? And we're far down that road. So we're much more into the nuts and bolts of communication, change management, and so on. So that's kind of been our experience. I'm hoping to be able to demonstrate at a future BPM Plus meeting. Several of you have seen early prototypes of the work we're doing. It is my goal to actually show what I'm talking about at our next meeting. So what else should I cover, or questions that folks might have about what we're up to?
The one, Jane, could you spend, I think you're right, Mayo gets it, right? You don't have to discuss the value proposition, but it does seem like the value proposition is this critical place to start, because as you go through the playbook, what you're going to see is there needs to be an investment. It's human and fiscal and really temporal as you go along to implement this. So if you could talk, I think just a little bit about what value you see. Once you open the playbook, you're going to see we took the liberty that there's a subtitle, and I was struck by it again last night: establishing shareable clinical pathways to care for families and communities. Obviously, we're caring for individuals, but we're really doing this family community perspective too. And so I think that first leap seems really critical. So if you could just talk a little bit about, I think that it would be
sure. And you made a really important observation, is that different stakeholders have different perspectives on what the value is. So the main value, I think, is just what you said, is that we are trying to deliver standardized best practice evidence-based care to patients and families. We want to make sure that people get consistent, high quality care. And so that's kind of what drives everything. And that is definitely the first step. And this is a mechanism to do that. As I say, a lot of energy goes into gathering evidence, establishing knowledge, putting together best practices, documenting, distributing those. But how do we get that to the bedside and to the patient? And this is really a mechanism to, in a very deliberate way, represent that knowledge in a way that it can be implemented consistently, translated into care processes. So how do we take documents and translate those into action? And so the primary value proposition is that delivery of high value care to patients, families, communities. But then there are some very pragmatic things as well. So standardization of practice results in the more efficient use of resources. If things are repeatable and streamlined and the right care is being delivered and the wrong care is not being delivered, there's a standardization for the sake of value to the patient. So how can we get the best care at the lowest consumption of resources? So that's a piece of it. I come at it from a very strange perspective in a way, which is the knowledge management side. So how can we be very explicit about knowing what care we're providing and knowing what we know, making sure that all of the care team has access to the same knowledge? How do we make sure that we are consistent no matter what interaction the patient is having, where they are on their patient journey, how they're interacting with the system, that their experience is consistent, that the care being delivered is consistent? And so from a knowledge management standpoint, being very explicit about what these care pathways are helps us really to understand that. So the value proposition comes from multiple perspectives, but I think as Dr. Cullen said, it's really about the efficient delivery of standardized, high quality, and high value care. And you might want to elaborate on that. That's kind of your bailiwick as well.
Yeah. Well, I just think from having been multiple roles in the clinical healthcare system as well as the public healthcare system, what we know is that there's lots of gotchas in this whole process, and this ability to align, in a sense, you're aligning mission and value, and you're able to say that the investment will, in the long run, really change outcomes. And as you guys know, especially in the last year, there's been so many rapidly changing things, really difficult to implement into the clinical care pathways, as well as the understanding that I really believe that this work, once established within an organization, which is the point of the playbook, the goal of the playbook is to help you as an organization, individual, we've already talked about the different stakeholders here, be able to more rapidly move to establish clinical pathways, adopt clinical pathways in a way that is consistent. Because remember, we've talked, and I think Jane just reiterated this need for a structured, standard approach to this. So the hope is that the playbook will be your guide. In a sense, it's your training wheels. It's to keep you from going off onto a third rail. And obviously, it still needs a lot of work and input from all of you, but we believe it can give you that basic structure, in a sense, an infrastructure to be able to move forward with adopting clinical pathways. So I think with that, we could walk through the document itself, but I can put the link in there. I think what would be helpful for us is for you guys to, and we apologize that we're always just in time, work in progress, but for you to give us some feedback on that would be helpful. We have internally talked about and we'll make sure the slides that we have were available to you. What other support options would be available to organizations and or groups that wanted to move ahead? And we've come up with some options, including additional information materials, the possibility of having some training, some mentoring. We do have an ongoing work group that meets, and people are, we obviously are extending an invitation to participate in that work group. We will be figuring out what our work products will be for the next year. I think some of them will include an iteration on, probably not a lot of iteration on the RAMM, but definitely an ongoing iteration on the playbook and perhaps some additional appendices. What we've seen this past year, especially with playbooks in public health, is the creation and adoption of a lead playbook and then secondary playbooks for people that are interested in one particular section of it, and extending that and or other additional topical areas that we may or may not have thought about. But I think what we'd like to do is use the rest of this time with a dialogue with you and to get your feedback. Ken, does that seem okay, or what do you think?
You know, that seems great. I was actually just messaging to Jane that one of the things that I think would be really interesting. We've got a good crowd here. I'd be really interested in folks that, you know, were interested in the session that see some opportunities, because I think one of the things we're going to want to do in fairly short order is pilot this with some organization, let them kick the tires and let us know what works and what doesn't work, and you know, let's see how effective this is. So I'd be really interested in hearing from attendees, you know, what your thoughts are.
So feel free to unmute yourself and share any feedback with us, or your own experience, or your own knowledge of additional tools or guidance that's out there that you believe has been effective or might be effective for you as you move forward. And I do think there's one question here. Efficacy of adoption process versus the efficacy of a specific pathway.
Oh, that one I caught. That was the metrics section.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the other thing, what we might consider doing is for folks, my guess is most people haven't really looked at the RAMM. So maybe the best way to kind of interact with this, just for folks to get their head around it, is, you know, suggest, and maybe we can pick on Jane to start, is pull up the assessment model, and then let's just pick one particular, you know, element of that, and then compare it to what's happening at Mayo Clinic around your program, for instance. And then how would that, based upon that discovery or of maturity, how would you use the playbook to, you know, to address potential shortcoming? I think a real example might help make it real, because right now we're kind of floating at 50,000 feet.
Sure. Do you want me to bring it up, or if somebody else? Probably we don't want to switch presenter. If somebody could bring that up, and then I could talk to it. So you want me to pick out one that we're pretty bad at?
I leave it up to you. I just think that the idea of showing an example is good. Yeah.
Here I can, I figured out how to make it bigger. So I think I can share and we can be okay, hopefully.
Okay.
Does that work for other folks? And I think people are reticent to come off mute, but really the whole intention of BPM Plus is that this is a community, and it's not that any one stakeholder has all the answers. It's that collectively we learn from each other, right? So please feel free to jump in. We'd love to hear your experiences.
Hopefully you guys can see this is this is from the playbook itself, but as Ken talked about, we will be making the RAMM. It is available as a segregated document. These are the RAMM maturity levels here. There's 2 pages, so not to make you dizzy, but these would be the 2 different ones that we could pay attention to. Jane, is there anything specific you would want me to go to? I think it probably
Sure.
important, before we go, let's just talk about the different levels, and you can see the description. They're very typical to what you've probably experienced with maturity models in the past. And you can see level 5 is named the Learning Health System. As you know, that has been a conceptual and implemented model, really championed by Chuck Frieden in Michigan, but has been embraced by many healthcare systems, integrated healthcare systems, as well as standalones, as well as individual practices to get us to that learning health system. And remember, that learning health system requires the ability to quickly iterate and modify what you are doing based on best practices that you have either gathered yourself and or have recently been published. So any specific area, Jane, you want me to?
Sure. So maybe what I'll do is I'll pick two, and I'll pick one where we're pretty far along the pathway, and then I'll pick one where we have oodles of opportunity. And the second one is metrics. I foreshadowed that a little bit, and I'm telling tales on myself since that's kind of my responsibility. But so I'll start out with the institutional standards, guidelines, and policies. And as you can see, as Terry said, there are these different levels of maturity where the lowest one is really ad hoc. So it's very reactive, and any advocacy for adoption of a clinical pathway is going to be an individual champion or a proponent who has a great idea, but the organization's not on board. And then each of the maturity levels has a little bit more rigor and buy-in and things in place. So if you look at the middle tier here, the level 3, that's an organization where there are people identified at the institution that uses a documented, standardized, consistent approach for evaluating and accepting clinical guidelines. So there is some mechanism to say, yes, we want to bring on board the latest guideline on X. And there are policies in place that address things like change management, knowledge management, metrics. There is some level of funding and executive support in place, and there are resources, and that adoption is audited to ensure compliance with adoption policies. So that's a pretty good place to be. That's our things are defined and standard. The next level are things quantitatively managed, and at the top level, the learning health system is it ongoing and evolving. And I think in my limited experience with maturity models, and I think Terry will have much more experience and be able to pitch in here, but I often find that it's a little bit of a gradation between a couple of levels as you think about it. You don't land squarely in a 3 or squarely in a 4. But I would say that my organization has bits of 3, 4, and 5. But I think the key things, we are really blessed to be an organization that does not only easily and appropriately adjust guidelines to incorporate emerging best practices, but are aggressive about doing that. So as an academic medical center, we have faculty who are actively engaged in defining the emerging best practices and are committed to making sure that those emerging best practices are brought to bear in the care of every patient. So we have that culture in place. We have an organization that is in place. We have a multidisciplinary clinical staff where the faculty routinely get together and discuss and lead change and lead the implementation of these best practices. And so in that sense, we're very much a level 5. As far as, yeah.
Sorry, this is Ken. If I could jump
Yeah.
in on that, because something you said there that I think it's really shows to me the value of the assessment tool. So your comment about an organization having pieces all across the map, I think is very common. The way I look at the maturity models is you effectively you get scored at the highest level where you complete all the criteria,
Mhm.
right? So if you're at level 3 for everything except for auditing, and you're level 4 and 5 for everything else, then you're a level 3 organization, right?
Okay.
And that
Mhm.
also defines the gap that you need to close, because it's like, well, if we could assure that we've got that audit and so on, then we've closed off that level and we promote to the next level. So I think that's a great example of kind of how to use these things to self-assess, figure out where you are falling short, and where you want to be, right? Because not everybody
Mhm.
needs to be a level 5 at everything. So
Right.
you decide where you want to be, where you're falling short, and then put into place some sort of remediation plan. And that's where you can use the playbook. Over.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep. So that. Mhm.
and I would just follow up on that, Ken. I agree with you. And the other thing that's important for those of you who have used CMM is if you can get buy-in from your organization, then individual units in your organization can also self-evaluate. And Jane, I think you probably have had this experience. I don't know for sure, but there's probably individual units that have really embraced and accelerated and are moving along, obviously within the institutional structure. So the institutional structure, and this isn't specific to Mayo at all, but the institutional structure itself sometimes is an impediment, right? But that doesn't mean that within that institution, a group can't move ahead and really try to accelerate. And, we see that a lot. This concept of tipping point and in a tipping point in an organization, it's usually because some group is really pushing and saying, this is where we need to go. And then at that tipping point, everybody in the institution then buys into it. So I think the exciting thing about having a maturity model, especially in this place, in this arena, is that understanding that you need champions, but you don't need to have everybody as a champion initially. And Jane, I think that's probably been your experience too at Mayo, right?
Yeah, yeah, it really has been. We have actually, we had an external review come in and take a look at my program, which was very interesting. But one of the things they said is that Mayo has a tendency to let 1,000 flowers bloom. So it's an organization with many, many committed champions, but it doesn't necessarily say from the top down, we are going to focus on A, B, and C right now. Everybody, you're all on board. Here's what we're doing. So yes, there are many, many champions. And in that sense, as I look at this maturity model, do we have systematic? So I'm looking at level 4, systematic governance to oversee the virtuous cycle of deployment, measurement, feedback, and improvement with processes, systems, training, building organizational trust. We don't have a single governance system that oversees this across the board. We have a culture with multiple governance groups who have this approach, who are using the virtuous cycle, but not so that's an interesting one. So it is systematic, it's not central. So we do have systematic governance that oversees that, but it might be the Department of Nursing, or it might be cardiology, or it might be pharmacy, or it might be a multidisciplinary group that's tackling some particular thing. But we do have the systematic governance in place. So you're exactly right. It's not just that the whole organization is on board right now doing one thing.
Right. Right. And I also think that what we have seen in the last year with COVID is this incorporation, this desire to really incorporate emerging best practices that we're changing on a very regular basis. And so in some ways, I think COVID has pointed out the need for this ability to have a more rapid response and rapid integration of newness, new guidance as we go along. Does anybody else want to share their experience related to that one? And then Jane can talk about one of the other areas. We can go. Jamie, were you going to do metrics?
I was.
Goals and measurement, right?
Yep, goals and measurement.
Going? Yeah, you're out. Yeah. Okay, there we go.
So in this arena, again, level 1 is always sort of ad hoc. If things happen, it's pretty isolated and almost accidental. Level 2, deployment goals are established, promulgated, and measured, but with inconsistent results across the enterprise. The approach for measuring is inconsistent and may vary across organizational units, and routine adjustment of processes to advance outcomes is focused within organizational units rather than across the organization. Level 3, we've got the adoption of quality measures, dashboards, goals, and quality reporting deployed consistently across the enterprise, including points of care. We have the use of the tools at the point of care. We have institutional tracking of common processes, pathways, adherence metrics, enterprise visibility, established enterprise accountability. And we have defined key process indicators for driving consistent measuring and reporting of progress and improvement of feedback. To get to level 4, we want pathway adoption and compliance is measured and monitored by supporting tools and practices, and that the monitoring of the guideline used to provide feedback and improve the pathway efficacy, and the enterprise has established processes that are used for impact, predictive risk assessment, and management. I would say that our organization is not yet at level 4 because the pathway adoption and compliance is measured and monitored by supporting tools and practices, but it's quite variable. And the data can be difficult to pull, difficult to analyze. And because there are a variety of pathways that touch a variety of parts of a complex organization, having a standard approach to say, okay, we know exactly what we're going to measure, how we're going to measure it. We can grab the data sources, we can do the analysis, and we can show how we're doing. It's not consistent across the board. It's more at a per pathway or group of pathway levels. The other thing that I would say is that pathways can be adopted through a variety of mechanisms, and the way that we measure depends on the mechanisms used. So we really aren't at a standard approach for that. Monitoring the guideline used to provide feedback and improve pathway efficacy, that definitely happens. That happens much more at the practice level, at the discipline level. So if endocrinology is putting into place a perioperative glycemic control pathway, they will be gathering data and monitoring the efficacy of that pathway. Whereas if infectious diseases is doing something with a C. diff pathway, they will be collecting the data and analyzing the data and looking at the efficacy of the pathway itself. So this is where we got into the discussion of measuring the efficacy of the pathway versus measuring the adoption process. So the pathway efficacy is really, at least in my mind, that's a scholarly activity that occurs at the research and faculty level, that is discipline by discipline or multidisciplinary, depending on the topic. But that therefore is somewhat variable both in the approach and the application. As far as the enterprise having established processes for impact, predictive risk assessment, and management, I think that is one that we're getting much closer to. We have had an clinical impact reporting group in place. But again, some of the same challenges with getting the data necessary to really do that is not insignificant. I will say that from an organizational standpoint, the fact that we have moved from being an organization that uses multiple independent medical records to an organization that uses a single medical record has simplified in many ways the ability to get data, as well as investments that the organization has made in its overall approach to data management. So we're getting closer on that one. I'd be very interested in hearing other organizations and how they approach metrics and what consistent approaches and tools they have in place.
Does anyone want to share? I have not been monitoring the chat, so I don't know if there's something in here.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the chat right now. The organization's level of commitment to implementing shareable clinical pathways and published evidence on improved outcomes or quadruple aim achievement. You know, this is an interesting one for me because, as I say, metrics has not been a personal strength of mine, but one of the things I've been really interested in, first of all, we primarily as an organization, when we're talking about implementing guidelines, what we generally do is measure the process outcomes rather than patient outcomes. We certainly measure patient outcomes as a part of research all the time, but when we're putting a new pathway in place, what we tend to do is measure the process measures. So if the issue is we want to make sure that a patient has 2 blood cultures done before you start the antibiotic, we aren't looking necessarily at the outcome of a C. diff patient. What we are looking at is what percentage of the patients appropriately had 2 blood cultures done before the antibiotic was hung. And so that's a differentiation we make in the implementation measurement. Did it solve the process problem that we were trying to solve? I tend to view it as distinct. Do the C. diff patients do better if you have 2 blood cultures before you start the antibiotic? And there are definitely people who look at that. And I just can't speak for the whole organization. In my world of implementing pathways, what we focus on is those process measurements. So I'd be really interested in other people's experience between teasing out patient outcomes from process measurements and whether that's a distinction others make or how they handle that.
Does anybody have any experience with that they'd like to share?
So, hello, Pete Haug here. Just, I'm not exactly sure if this matches up exactly, but recently we've been working with some protocols for treating patients with pneumonia in the ED, and we've been doing some implementation research in that area. And we've been getting results that are promising, reduction of mortality, better dispositioning of patients. And one of the things we watch are process measures, the simplest one being whether the protocol was actually used for a given pneumonia patient. There being a lot of physicians that think they know all about pneumonia and don't need this doggone computer to help them out. And there is an association with better outcome measures and utilization of the protocol. So.
Barry, you're muted.
Muted.
That's a really, Peter, thank you for sharing that. It's a very insightful comment about, and I want to go back to this alignment, about alignment of individuals that will be affected by it. So, so I can be as arrogant a physician as the rest of them and say, I know my way to treat pneumonia is better than anybody else's, even though it's the TC way and not any endorsed way. So I think it does point out, once again, this organizational commitment and the role that needs to play, and the engagement of the different stakeholders. And once again, you'll see that in the playbook. We haven't identified everyone, but the understanding that the impact of moving to this kind of approach benefits from different people agreeing and understanding, and that need to identify what the individual and or organizational obstacles are to move that along. So thank you for sharing that. Anybody else have any experience that they want to talk about adoption or feedback just on what you've seen so far? We realize since this is a just-in-time work in progress, you didn't have time to look at it before.
I don't have anything to add, but maybe a question that arises in my head. It's rather on a more abstract level. Shouldn't there be a political will to, gather all the pathway information to share this knowledge and the whole health system? I'm not sure if that is the right event to talk about this, but I would be interested if there are any activities on a political level to merge those knowledge items.
This is Ken. I can speak to that at least a little bit, get the ball rolling. So let me throw the video back on for a second. So speaking as the champion of the overall community, when we started down this road, the first hope was to engage a lot of the large vendors to support this natively within their platforms, like the electronic health record systems. And for a variety of reasons, that hasn't happened. But we're still strongly interested in kind of getting to that outcome, not just the EHR vendors, but beyond that. And the play and the approach that we've been taking is to engage with the clinical specialty societies. So at present, we have a small handful of those organizations from the US participating in BPM Plus, the American College of Emergency Physicians, the American College of Surgeons as examples. And we're currently exploring some broader relationships within the specialty societies. So the idea is, as these are the organizations that come to market with what is considered good practice for, in this case, surgery and emergency medicine, if we can expand that to other specialties and have them agree on a shared formalism in terms of documenting their pathways, at some point it becomes much easier for the software to just import the standard than it does to have to handcraft every single pathway from every different format. So the early indications are very positive with that. We have several examples that have been done successfully. As a community, we're not adopting pathways. So BPM Plus is not going to endorse this hypertension protocol or that COVID protocol. That's not our job. Our job is to say, this is what a well-formed one looks like. And Mayo Clinic might have their version or variant of a particular pathway, and someone else might have theirs, and let the marketplace decide which one is better. But let's not compete on the formalism. Let's decide functionally. The other is this notion of kind of automatability. Can you have these machine interpretable and process automation? And there are certainly people that want to go there, but I would submit that that's not the only potential end state. So for instance, the OB community used this approach to develop a set of pathways, and then took a paper document and made that a requirement spec for some vendors that were supporting them. So in this case, they didn't use the automation piece at all, but they found it reduced their implementation timeline by a third. It improved the accuracy of the implementation because they had a more precise and accurate set of requirements. So I think my hope here is to build a bandwagon, so we get more and more people kind of behind this. But I think if we're going to succeed in the market, it's going to be driven from the content side of things, as you have not just in the US, but globally, these emerging practices, and they're just too hard to consume right now. And it's very expensive to bring those into an organization, a provider organization, and to implement them. And if we can reduce that time and improve the efficacy, I think that's a winner for everyone. Over.
Thanks, Ken, for that. I think that, Ken, what you've pointed out is that, first off, I want to remind people that there are other health work groups in BPM Plus that are working on these other issues, authoring, process automation, enablement. This is the adoption and change management. But I do want to highlight the one thing Ken said about efficiency and timeliness, right? That's what we're seeing more and more in the clinical and the public health realm, the need to really accelerate the adoption, implementation into the system itself. And the hope is that this process change will enable that to be, will decrease the time that it takes to ensure that we have incorporation of best practices. And I think the important thing the other important thing Ken said is that our work group at least is not evaluating what's best practice from a clinical pathway. It's really evaluating how do we get clinical pathways adopted and the change management that accompanies that process change itself. So in a sense, it's a process change. Anybody else have any other comments? Feedback? Things you'd like to know more about? I want to remind people too that the other work groups, so there's authoring, process automation, engagement, academic and professional education, methodology. So there's 5 work groups overall. We work tangentially with all of them and then come together and share. This work group obviously has had its focus on organizational adoption and change management, and the RAMM and the Playbook have been designed around how to accelerate, first off, as you can tell from the RAMM, an organization and or other groups self-evaluation and or external evaluation. And then the Playbook is really designed to help lead and guide, once again, a group or an organization through the adoption and the change management that adoption requires as they move forward. So, any other questions at all? So the last thing we had wanted to talk about was really, first off, when you guys get the slides, or now if you want to just feedback to us anything you think that might be helpful for your organization to move forward to adopt BPM Plus. We've talked briefly about some of that, which is sharing opportunities, mentoring, the potential for mentoring, the potential to pair different organizations with other organizations that may be at different stages of adoption to try to lead them through really that organizational mentoring, which, we don't see a lot of. We don't see a lot of cross-organizational mentoring, at least in the US, but it's obviously a great model. We know it works in many other things. Feedback and edits to the document. And then I just want to remind people the next step. So this, I think Ken pushing it out to the website meant it got released, that it's published as a release candidate, the Playbook. And once again, we will make sure that the RAMM itself is also published as a separate document. Right now, what you're seeing is the implementation of the RAMM into the Playbook itself. But just to remind people, the first thing we did was the capability maturity model, and then we went into the Playbook, driving ourselves from the capability maturity model. Your reviews and your edits and your comments would be really helpful. Ken may want to talk briefly about what it means for something to become an official artifact and the process that occurs with that with BPM.
And I think he had to step away for just a second.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Peter, did you have a comment or did you just come off mute?
No, I didn't have anything
Okay.
additional.
Thanks.
If you guys all don't mind, I do have a quick question.
Sure.
So I work for Red Hat, and I guess from a BPM Plus perspective, we're a sponsor and a tool vendor. And I'm kind of new to the organization, but not new to health IT. I've been doing it for 30 years. And I'm really interested in, if somebody like Red Hat, I'm not trying to sell you anything, but if somebody like us had a bunch of these shareable clinical pathways, pre-done boilerplate that you could take as templates and customize to your own use, would that be a good thing? Or would you rather just kind of roll your own using the standards? I'm trying to get an idea of what the market might be like.
So when you say that you would have the shareable clinical pathways, would you be partnering with professional societies or doing your own systematic reviews and generating clinical pathways, or what would be
Yeah, that's
the
a good
knowledge you
question.
use?
I think it would probably be a combination of those. I think we would probably have to, partner with specialty groups or industry groups to kind of collect best practices, not being a healthcare organization and not having, doctors on staff. We would have to do something like that. And it would just be what the perspective or lens we would look at it from is an accelerator. Here, we're not starting from scratch. Here's a collection of these things to help you get started. They're already done with our tool. We have documentation, training around it, etc.
Well, and there's organizations like Motive that aspire to be knowledge vendors, right? To be working with the colleges and then having something that's reasonably shareable, but then localizable once you get into an organization. And that's a little bit about what some of that localization section in the methodology playbook is about, as opposed to the adoption playbook.
Yeah. Just real quick, we have for many years had a large number of text, basically PDFs that describe best practices and care in different circumstances, and have been working to convert a subset of those into working protocols, and in some cases using one mechanism and in some cases using another. Our impression is that if we can get these things to be interoperable, and I'm basically thinking truly plug and play, which includes a different set of standards besides the ones we're talking about. It probably includes the HL7 fire standards. But if we can get a combination of those standards and these standards based on the BPM Plus collection of standards and tools, there will be a market for those things, and there'll also be a job description that becomes fairly important for people who can manipulate those to fit the processes involved to local settings. Because when you build a few of these processes and you look at them, you discover that it's easy. Well, I shouldn't say easy. You can certainly get the medical knowledge jammed into these things pretty well, but then processes, the local behaviors tend to vary from place to place, as well as the capabilities based on resources in their labs and radiology departments and things like that. And so you will need some people who know how to take existing processes and manipulate and change them to fit local capabilities. And it's that interesting job that will become, as I say, a local job, to take the generic ones that are created, or the ones that are created for big places like Mayo, and convert them so little places like 100 or 200 bed hospital can live with them. That will be a very interesting job category.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you and Lorraine have both touched on the localization piece. I think that we talk about more about the change management of implementation, but the nuts and bolts technical pieces, if you're going to go computable, there's also the definition of all of the concepts and the data model that's used. So as Ken pointed out, these pathways can be used for a variety of things. They could be a specification for an implementation. They could be a specification for a manual or paper-based process. But if what you're talking about is shareable clinical pathways that can be executed, actually computed on, then I think that you would need to be pretty explicit on what your data inputs are. And I'm sure, I don't know, maybe Dr. Haug can comment on that piece as well, that where a guideline might just say, well, I need to know if the patient has atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Okay, what are you going to pull out of the record to say if that is true or false? Just as an example. So localization's a piece. Yep.
Yeah, and every time you leave the finding of fact to an interpretation by whatever clinician is in the room with the patient, you do raise the possibility of variability in application. So if you can possibly tie things back to defined properties and compute them, that's always a good thing. We built a number of different examples so far, and you basically spend a lot of time in the medical record, the historical medical record, trying to decide what facts are present and reliable enough to get you to where you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
I want to comment on the Mark, I think it was you from Red Hat comments. Not everybody's Mayo. Mayo's amazing. I'm so grateful I've had the opportunity to work with Jane, but I've spent most of my life working with resource constrained, and not that Mayo doesn't have some resource constraints too, but resource constrained communities. And what that usually means is there's also cognitive constraints. It's because people are too busy doing direct care to patients. And they don't have any time to think, and there may be organizational commitment and will to do this kind of work, but there's not, there may not be the resourcing, either fiscally or human. So to go back to that comment about, is there any benefit in having some of this work done and figuring out just how to implement it? I think that it's a great question, and I think it will depend on the institution and the setting and the resource availability. So the last thing we want to do is create more inequity between healthcare settings, because that inequity then translates into inequity for what patients receive, the care that they receive. So it's a great question. I don't have the answer to it, but I do think that the institutional resources may result in people making different decisions. And it actually may be why mentoring becomes really important. We call the haves and the have-nots in the healthcare system, and we still do that now. But how do we accelerate adoption of this kind of work in a setting that may look at it and go, oh my God, I barely have anybody supporting me from a technical perspective. I can't take on anything else, when in the long run, the integration of it and the adoption would result in better care at, in some ways at less technical cost. So I'm intrigued conceptually by it. I don't know what it would look like.
This is Ken. A couple of thoughts there, if I'm not overusing my nickel. One is the idea of, and I'm going to try to tie in a couple of the other BPM groups. So we've got the process and automation enablement group, which is really trying to get developers on board with this. And, there are a lot of open source health systems out there. I mean, Terry, you hailed from Reagan Street at some point, right? I mean, they have have an offering that's being used in the disadvantaged, nations and of the world. So we could try to close that last mile and get support within those kinds of platforms. I think that's one piece of this. I'm thrilled that we've got a good global participation on today's call. That's really exciting. Most nations have some form of socialized care when you look across the globe. So the idea that these pathways are being developed in common formalisms, and at the point they're published and available, some of that happens in the U.S. in federal agencies, like the VA publishes out care pathways. There's a TBI protocol out there, et cetera, traumatic brain injury. And I think as we can get more and more health provider organizations on board with this, especially national programs, we'll start to see more content availability as well. So I think between the open source and other commercial offerings on the technology side, and then more open content from government sponsored and nonprofit sponsored work, I think there's really an opportunity to impact.
Yeah, and I think in the time of 2021, as we're all emerging from 2020, we should challenge ourselves to be really audacious in terms of where we want to go, because if the last year, at least from my perspective, from a public health perspective, has taught us anything as an institution, is that the need to be have standards and be replicable and be able to quickly integrate new learning is critical. And I think BPM Plus and hopefully this work that we've done is one way to augment and accelerate that goal. So, any other comments from anybody? Ken, you weren't. Oh, go ahead, Jane.
Oh, no, you're going to say the same thing I was going to. Go ahead.
Yeah, Ken, I was wondering if you could talk a little, well, hopefully we were going to say the same thing. If you would talk a little bit about the next steps that the playbook, I think because you pushed it out, is now a release candidate, but I wasn't sure. And then what would happen next, or?
Yeah, and forgive me, I had to step away for a moment. So in terms of the governance, my hope is this will be the first artifact through the community approval or ratification process, so that this would go to a member vote, in effect, simple majority vote, and then we would issue it as a BPM plus health document. So the timing on that will be driven from the work group. So these processes are not yet authored. I mean, we're kind of making a little of this up as we go, but I think there are established precedents. So what I would expect would happen is following the way OMG typically does things, is that it would be up to the work group to recommend adoption to the membership. So I would think you would take a work group vote, and that's not like a formal vote necessarily. I mean, that could be people that show up. You can, we can figure out the best way to do that. But in effect, the organizational adoption change management work group would vote to recommend, or would there'd be some sort of decision to recommend a community vote. And then once it passes that hurdle, then we would issue it to the community members for a simple majority vote, and then once that passes, then it's done. So we want this to be as unonerous a process as possible. So we'll figure, and work with you to kind of chart this course. I think in terms of whether you want to advance that right away or provide a window for folks to look at the published draft for comment and get some feedback to you and make some final tweaks. I'll leave that to the work group. So that's really your decision as work group chairs. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, that does. So our hope would be, I'm going to speak for the work group, is that within the next 4 weeks, we'll be able to do that internal voting and then push it out, and then we'll let the OMG itself figure out how we go forward, how BPM Plus, how we go forward. Okay, are there any other comments, feedback, points of discussion? Thanks, everybody. I think we're near to being done. Anybody else have any other comments? Jane, anything you? We, first off, we're really grateful you spent all this time with us. Thank you so much. I realize, time is a valuable commodity, and hopefully we've been able to share with you where we've gone, and you have a sense of where we want to go. And so if you would like to engage more, we would welcome engagement in our work group, and the meetings are open for sure. And we hope that the work we've done will help accelerate ensuring that patients and families get better care.
Terry, you might want to plug when your calls are and that people can find them on the BPM Plus calendar.
Do you want to?
Oh, thanks, Lorraine. Yeah, so we would like people to, we would love the input. We would love to have more people participate in this. We are Tuesdays at 1 o'clock, every other Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern. And I'm just looking at my calendar to make sure I get the right one here. So our next meeting is April 6th. Yes, April 6th at 1 o'clock Eastern time. There we are. Thank you.
And can you put a link in the chat room for the invitation on the chat box?
And just so you know, there are also ICS downloads for the series of meetings on the right-hand side here of the calendar. So you could import them directly into your personal calendar if you're interested in any of these work groups.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody.